I remember my first night shift as a caregiver in an assisted living home like it was yesterday. I was a bit nervous, which felt normal for a new job. I was one of the few people taking care of the residents at night, and honestly, the place was quiet. Almost too quiet. A little after I started, I got the usual instructions. Walk the halls and make sure everyone was safe and comfortable. I was determined to do a good job, and everything was smooth at first. But then one of the residents, Mrs. Edna, an older woman who mostly kept to herself, called me over. She held out a folded piece of paper and told me to keep it safe, like it was something important. I thought it was just one of those notes she wrote to remember things, so I thanked her and tucked it into my pocket. Later, during my next round, I passed her room again and remembered the paper. I'd completely forgotten about it, but out of curiosity, I took a look. Her handwriting was small and shaky, and the words were kind of jumbled, but it was clear enough. Beware of the man in the hallway. I chuckled to myself, thinking it was just something she'd imagined, maybe a mixed-up memory or some kind of hallucination. Working there, I knew seniors sometimes saw or heard things that weren't real. But at the same time, that note gave me this strange, uneasy feeling. It was the kind of thing you think you'll forget, but it sticks in the back of your mind, like you shouldn't ignore it. As I kept making my rounds, I tried to brush it off. I mean, I knew there was no man in the hallway. The night was calm, but things started to feel different around midnight. I walked past the security room, and that's when I noticed something odd on one of the monitors showing a hallway near Mrs. Edna's room. There was this slight movement, almost like a shadow, but before I could make it out, it vanished. I blinked a few times, wondering if my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling crept back up. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination acting up because of her note. The next round, I went back down that hallway to check things out, but everything was just as it should be. The silence was strange. I could hear the ticking of the wall clocks clearly. When I passed the monitors again, I tried not to stare, but I ended up seeing that same movement, only a bit clearer this time. It wasn't just a random shadow. It looked like the shape of someone standing in the hallway, still, almost as if they were looking straight at the camera. Goosebumps ran down my arms. I took a deep breath and got closer to the screen, but as soon as I blinked, the figure was gone again. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things, or if there was actually something strange going on. I tried to walk around the building to calm myself down and check that everything was all right. Each hallway felt longer and darker than usual, and I started noticing every little sound around me. When I got back to the desk, I decided to take one last look at the monitors, kind of just to prove to myself that I was overreacting. But when I looked at the cameras this time, that same shadow was there again, in the exact hallway where I just walked by. And this time, it didn't move away or disappear. The figure just stood there, almost like it was waiting. My heart started pounding, and I felt a cold chill down my spine. I looked at the intercom, thinking about calling security, but I remembered I'd already tried reaching them, with no luck. By now, I was fully on edge. I scanned through the cameras and saw that the figure seemed to be moving from one camera to the next, drifting through the hallways, but always on the same floor I was on. I couldn't tell if it was just nerves or something else, but I started feeling this strange, heavy air around me. Each minute felt longer than the last, and I had this gut feeling that I wasn't alone. No matter how hard I tried to keep my cool, whatever was there seemed determined to make me notice it. My palms were sweaty, and my breathing got shallow as I started seriously considering getting out of the building before anything worse happened. I decided to do one more quick round, but this time I was a lot more careful. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I found myself avoiding the hallways where I'd seen that figure on the cameras. The feeling of being watched was getting stronger, and every step echoed in a way that made me feel exposed. When I passed Mrs. Edna's room again, she called me over with a scared look on her face. I tried to reassure her, but before I could say anything, she pointed toward the hallway and whispered that he was already there, waiting. That froze me in my tracks. This didn't feel like some confused memory or hallucination. The fear in her eyes was real, And for the first time that night, I felt genuinely afraid. I went back to the monitors with shaky hands. The figure was there again, only closer this time, almost at the end of the hallway leading toward my station. I froze, unable to look away from the screen, and I swear it felt like it was looking straight into the camera. The image was grainy, but the feeling of something, or someone, in the hallway was impossible to ignore. I tried calling security again, but the phone was dead. No signal. The silence around me was absolute, and I realized that no matter what I did, I had no way of calling for help. I was stuck there with whatever was in that hallway, whether it was real or not. At that point, I decided I had to leave and head to the main entrance, hoping someone could help me or maybe I'd get cell signal there. But as I turned into the hallway, the air felt so thick it was like every step took double the effort. I started walking slowly, trying to control my breathing and stay focused, but I could feel something following me, even though I couldn't hear any footsteps but my own. Each time I looked back, I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger every second. When I finally got near the exit, I heard a sound coming from the hallway behind me, like a slow, dragging step. I froze halfway to the door, my hand shaking on the handle, torn between looking back or just making a run for it. I took a deep breath, trying to work up the nerve to glance back, and saw a shadow on the wall, slowly getting closer. I couldn't see its face or figure out what was happening, but I knew it wanted me to see it. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but when I finally managed to move, the figure was close enough that I could make out its silhouette at the end of the hallway, perfectly still. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were weighed down, like something was keeping me rooted to the spot. Cold sweat trickled down my neck, and the air around me felt thicker, almost unbearable. With all the strength I had, I forced myself to move and started backing away, keeping my eyes on the shadow at the end of the hall. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation for what I was seeing, but nothing added up. I wondered if it could be a resident who had gotten out or maybe some messed up prank, but something about the way that shadow stood there, dark and silent, told me it wasn't anything like that. As I backed up, the figure took small, measured steps forward, almost like it was enjoying watching me retreat. I hit a point where I couldn't move any further, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. Finally, I gathered the courage to sprint back to the monitor room, hoping the cameras might help me make sense of what was happening. But when I got there, my vision blurred, and the screens flickered like something was interfering with the signal. The figure showed up on multiple cameras, moving from one hallway to the next, always coming toward me. It felt like it knew exactly where I was, and the feeling of having nowhere to go left me in pure panic. It was like a twisted game, but I was the only one playing, and the feeling of being hunted made it impossible to think straight. Getting a job as a night janitor in that building was a relief, even if it wasn't exactly my dream job. On my first shift, the manager handed me a radio for communication and explained that I'd be working with an older colleague who had been around for years. That seemed like a good thing since the building was huge, with lots of floors and rooms. When I met my coworker on the first floor, I realized he was pretty friendly, like one of those people who knows all the secrets of the place. At one point, he mentioned, kind of jokingly, that the building had its weirdness and that sometimes he'd even hear footsteps where no one was supposed to be. I figured he was just trying to mess with the newbie, but there was something serious in his tone. Then, as soon as he went up to the next floor, I started hearing strange noises, little clicks and footsteps from places that should have been empty. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. After a while, I decided to go up to the second floor to see if I could catch up with him, but it was like he disappeared. I tried calling him over the radio, but all I got was silence. On the second floor, I noticed something strange. His radio was just lying there on a desk in the middle of the hallway. I picked it up and called his name a few times, but only silence came back at me. I started walking around the floor, checking each room and calling for him, but there was no response. With each passing minute, the building felt emptier, and his comment about the weirdness of the place kept echoing in my head. It was the kind of silence that gets under your skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take a break in the employee break room, hoping to clear my head a bit. When I got there, I found a water bottle and a lunchbox with an apple half-eaten, all left out like someone had left in a hurry. That sent a chill down my spine. He'd obviously rushed off, but where to? I called out over the radio again, but nothing. I checked my phone, but, of course, there was no signal, like the whole building was cut off from the outside world. After a bit, I decided to check out the upper floors to see if I could find any clue about where he went. On the third floor, I found a chair flipped over in the middle of the hallway, like someone had bumped into it. There were a few footprints on the floor that looked fresh, and I kept telling myself they had to be his. But everything just felt more and more off. I kept calling on the radio, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine, but the silence was getting louder. The feeling that I was completely alone in that massive building was hitting harder. I climbed up to the 5th floor, and that's when things really started to get weird. The lights were dimmer than the other floors, almost like they were flickering out. When I reached one of the offices, I heard a faint noise. It sounded like a chair scraping, but softer, like someone was dragging it on purpose. My heart was pounding as I pushed open the door, only to find an empty room. The only thing in there was a chair facing the window, like someone had been sitting there moments before. I started to wonder if this was all some kind of prank to freak out the new guy, but everything felt too real to just be a joke. The chair, the silent radio, his stuff left around. It didn't add up. I decided to go back down to the ground floor to wait outside, but when I reached the stairwell, I noticed something else. The emergency exit door was slightly open. That was against building rules, so I went over slowly to see what was going on. I pushed the door and found myself staring down a narrow, dimly lit hallway I didn't remember from the building tour. The walls looked different, like this part of the building hadn't been renovated in ages. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into some place I shouldn't be. Even so, I kept moving forward, thinking maybe my coworker had somehow ended up down here. As I walked down that hallway, the air felt heavier, almost hard to breathe. Then I saw something on the floor that stopped me cold. My coworker's ID badge, with his picture staring back at me. I picked it up, and it was cold, like it had been left there only moments ago. I looked around, calling his name again, but, as always, there was only silence. The thought that he might be stuck somewhere in this building started to seriously creep me out, but I was frozen by this deep sense of dread. Out of nowhere, the radio crackled with a faint, scratchy noise, breaking the silence. I grabbed it, hoping to hear his voice, but all that came through was this strange, distant noise, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't get the words out. The static grew louder, and in the middle of it, I swear I heard slow, echoing footsteps, as if they were coming from some far-off, empty space. The static faded, and the radio went dead again, leaving me in an even thicker silence. By now, I didn't know what was worse, the total silence or the creepy sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to leave that hallway, but somehow, it felt like I was walking in circles, like every turn and every door brought me back to the same spot. Finally, I pushed myself to head back down as quickly as I could, feeling like something was just a step behind me. When I finally reached the ground floor and got outside, it felt like a huge weight lifted off me, but the weird feeling didn't totally go away. The next day, I went to the manager and asked about my coworker, trying to make sense of what happened. She looked at me with surprise and told me there wasn't anyone else scheduled to work that shift. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night, but whenever I remember the radio crackling or that dim, creepy hallway, I still get chills down my spine. When I started working at this roadside coffee shop, everything seemed pretty normal. It was an easy job, perfect for saving some money while I figured out my life. On my first day, among the usual instructions, the boss mentioned something weird. Never go down to the basement. That area is off limits. I thought it was odd but shrugged it off, assuming it was just one of those strange workplace rules. Maybe it was full of old supplies or just a dusty storage space. I let it go and focused on my work, and for the first few days, everything was smooth. The first time I heard something coming from the basement was during a late shift. I was checking the cash register, ready to close up, when I heard a faint noise, a muffled sound, like something heavy being dragged down there. I froze for a second, completely thrown off by the strange rhythm of it. My first thought was that maybe an animal had somehow gotten in, but it sounded way too heavy for that. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off and finished my shift, trying to ignore the weird feeling it left me with. The next day, curiosity got the best of me, so I went straight to my boss to ask about the noise. As soon as I mentioned the basement, he looked uncomfortable and shut down the conversation quickly, saying I didn't need to worry about it. That only left me with more questions. It felt like he knew something that nobody else was supposed to know, like he was hiding a secret. I couldn't shake off the weird feeling all day, wondering what was really down there and why it seemed to be such a forbidden topic. I tried asking a few of my coworkers, but each one had a different answer about what was in the basement. One guy told me it hadn't been used in years, like it had been shut down since the place opened. Another said the owner kept old equipment down there, but no one really knew what exactly was stored. All these conflicting stories only made me more curious, and the worst part was that the noise kept coming back on those late-night shifts, like a mystery that just refused to go away. Closing shifts started getting more tense each night. I was always on edge, listening for any strange sounds. And then, one night, it happened again. The noise was louder this time, almost like something heavy was being dragged across the floor with more force. My stomach dropped, but I found myself inching closer to the basement door. I crouched down, trying to hear more clearly, and that's when I noticed a strange smell coming from the crack at the bottom of the door. It was this weird, sickly sweet odor that I couldn't place. It made me even more nervous. I thought about opening the door, but my hand was shaking just from touching the doorknob. I knew it was a terrible idea, but my curiosity was practically screaming at me. Just then, the noise stopped abruptly, and that silence was somehow even scarier than the sounds. It was like whatever was down there knew I was listening. I backed away, heart pounding, and hurried out of the building as fast as I could. From that point on, working there at night was never the same. After that night, all I wanted were some answers, but asking my coworkers only made things worse. One of the older employees finally gave me a warning, saying I should leave whatever's down there alone, that it wasn't my business to mess with it. He was dead serious, which just made the whole thing even creepier. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement and that weird noise. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, and it started to feel like everyone knew something I didn't. The noise kept coming back every night I worked late, and each time, it seemed to get a little closer, a little louder, like something was moving up those basement stairs. I found myself staring at the basement door, imagining what could be happening down there. One night, I swear I saw the doorknob turn, real slow, like something or someone was trying to come out. I froze, caught between running away and staying there, completely freaked out and unable to tear my eyes from that door. The last time I worked a night shift, things took a turn for the worse. I was alone, trying to close up as fast as possible to get out of there, when the noise started again. But this time, it sounded even closer, almost like it was coming from the bottom of the stairs. My heart was racing, and my breathing got heavy. I forced myself to walk slowly toward the basement door, every hair on my body standing up. I put my ear to the door, and through the silence, I could hear a faint, steady sound, almost like breathing, right on the other side. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not even looking back, feeling like something was watching me the whole way. I locked up the shop and bolted to my car. After that, I requested to switch to morning shifts and, thankfully, never had to work at night there again. To this day, I have no idea what was really down there. And honestly, I think it's probably best that way. I have no clue what might have happened if I'd actually opened that door. When I took the job as an administrative assistant at this delivery company, I thought my biggest challenge would be organizing paperwork and dealing with impatient clients. But in my second week, my boss asked me to handle a delivery to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. He said it was urgent, something that couldn't wait for the regular driver. It felt odd, sure, but I was eager to show some initiative, so I agreed. I left the office around 6 in the evening, with the sun already setting. The GPS led me to this isolated spot, with barely any streetlights, surrounded by abandoned warehouses and silence. When I arrived, the warehouse gate was wide open, but there wasn't a soul in sight, not even a security guard. The place was completely deserted, and it made me feel uneasy. The silence there wasn't normal, you know? It wasn't like the quiet you'd feel in an empty park. It was heavy, thick, almost hanging in the air. I looked around, expecting to see some worker or at least some sign of life, but there was nothing. I decided to just get it over with. I grabbed the package, locked my car, and walked up to the entrance. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed the lights were dim and the hallways stretched out endlessly. The metal structure made each of my footsteps echo, making me feel even more like I was being watched. But I was set on finishing the task quickly and getting out. Every step I took, the place seemed darker and more eerie. I even called out, sort of by accident, asking if anyone was there, but only my voice echoed back, bouncing off the metal walls. I found a shelf at the far end of the warehouse that seemed to be the spot for deliveries. I placed the package there, relieved and ready to leave as fast as I could. But just as I turned to head back, the lights above me started flickering. At first, it was just a couple of quick flashes, but then the entire place started blinking, like someone was messing with the switch. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was going on. My heart was racing, and I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was just an electrical issue. It was an old warehouse in the middle of nowhere. Of course, there could be a wiring problem. But then, I heard this muffled sound that made my blood run cold. It was like heavy footsteps, but with this strange, uneven rhythm, coming from somewhere deeper inside the warehouse. I couldn't see anything, but the sound kept getting louder, like something, or someone, was moving toward me. I tried not to panic, but my body just wouldn't listen. My feet were glued to the floor, and my mind was screaming at me to get out, but it felt like I was trapped, paralyzed by fear. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and told myself I needed to leave. When I finally managed to move, I started walking toward the exit as quickly as I could, trying not to look back. But every step I took, the sound of footsteps behind me matched my pace, getting louder and louder, as if someone was copying my movements, stomping right along with me. The panic really set in when the lights started shutting off, one by one. From the back of the warehouse toward the front, it was like something was chasing me in the dark, forcing me to pick up the pace. Without thinking twice, I started running, ignoring the pounding of my heart and the feeling that something was right behind me. When I finally reached the door, I felt one last flicker of light behind me, and for a split second, I almost turned around to see what it was. But something deep inside warned me not to, so I kept running until I was outside. The moment I got out, I practically jumped into my car, feeling my heart thudding so hard I thought it might burst. I locked the doors and sat there, frozen, trying to calm down and make sense of what had just happened. I looked back at the warehouse, hoping to see some logical explanation, maybe a person who had been messing with me. But there was no one, just silence and darkness, like the place had gone back to being just another empty warehouse in the middle of nowhere. I started the engine, ready to leave as fast as possible, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the wheel. As I drove off, I took one last look in the rearview mirror, and I swear I saw a faint light flashing inside, right at the entrance. It was like someone was standing there, watching me leave, without any hurry, just staring. That sight sent a shiver down my spine like nothing I'd ever felt before. A mix of fear and something I still can't put into words. I hit the gas and sped away, trying to shake that feeling, but even now, what happened that night haunts me. Since that night, I haven't been able to stop thinking about what could have been hiding in that warehouse. I got obsessed, imagining 1,000 theories about what could have caused those lights and sounds. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just an electrical issue and the echo of my own footsteps. But whenever I tried to forget, the image of that empty place and those flickering lights would pop back into my head, like a recurring nightmare. I talked to a few colleagues at work, but no one seemed to know anything strange about that warehouse. No one had ever gone there before, or even knew our company used it. For days, I did everything to push it out of my mind, but the smallest noise, a light flickering, would be enough to remind me. I felt like something had changed in me since then. My body would stay on high alert, as if it was waiting for something to appear, even in my own home. Weeks went by, but that feeling of being watched, especially when I was alone, never really went away. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, not even sure what I was expecting to see. Deep down, though, something inside me kept telling me that what happened in that warehouse wasn't normal, and that I'd been lucky to get out. To this day, I don't know what was in that warehouse or why all that happened, but one thing's for sure, something or someone was there with me that night. I've never told the full story to anyone, not even my family. Part of me thinks nobody would believe me, or they'd say I'm exaggerating. Even I try to convince myself it's not real sometimes. But the fear I felt was real. Every sound, every flickering light, every echoing footstep is as clear in my mind as if it happened yesterday. After that day, I refused to do any more deliveries. I came up with excuses, asked to be reassigned, and luckily, my boss didn't push it. I still work for the company, but whenever I see an isolated warehouse or an empty building, I feel that same chill run down my spine. I don't know if it was a coincidence, a wiring issue, or something I'll never understand. All I know is, even now, writing this, I feel like whatever was there that night is still with me, a shadow that's never really left.